You wake up before sunrise. There is no paycheck coming at the end of the month. There is no guaranteed wage. There is no bank account waiting for you. If you work today, you eat tonight. If you don't, you don't. This was normal life for most of human history. Before salaries existed, getting paid was uncertain, unstable, and often personal. Payment wasn't a number on a slip of paper. It was food, shelter, protection, favors, trust, and sometimes nothing at all. Imagine finishing a full day of work and being paid with bread, not as a metaphor. Real bread, handed to you at the end of the day. Enough to feed your family if prices didn't change overnight. This wasn't charity. This was the economy. Before salaries, work did not guarantee income. It only created a chance to survive. And that single difference shaped how people worked, moved, saved, rebelled, and disappeared. By the end of this story, you'll understand how people were actually paid before salaries existed, why payment was daily, unstable, and often unfair, and how this system quietly shaped the modern world we live in now. For most of history, wages were not monthly. They weren't even weekly. They were daily, sometimes hourly, sometimes per task. You worked. You were paid. The relationship ended at sunset. This system is called day labor. But that phrase hides how fragile life really was. A dock worker in a port city might line up at dawn, hoping to be chosen. If a ship arrived, he worked. If it didn't, he went home empty-handed. A farmer's helper might be paid in grain at harvest, then nothing for months. A builder might be paid per stone placed, per wall finished, per roof completed. Payment followed output, not time. And because of that, time itself had very little value. If you were sick, injured, or simply not chosen, your income dropped to zero. There was no safety net. No minimum wage, no concept of employment as we know it. You weren't hired. You were used. And this was not limited to ancient civilizations. In Europe, well into the 1800s, most workers were still paid daily or per task. Factories did not invent stability overnight. They inherited instability and slowly formalized it. Before salaries, there were three main ways people got paid. The first was payment in goods. Money was scarce, coins were heavy, change was rare. So payment came in what actually mattered: food, fuel, housing. A worker might receive bread, beer, meat, firewood, or a place to sleep. Sometimes the payment was literally a meal eaten on site. This created an invisible dependency. If your employer fed you, housed you, and paid you in goods, leaving meant losing everything at once. You weren't just quitting a job, you were abandoning survival. The second method was piecework. Instead of being paid for time, you were paid for output. One shirt sewn, one barrel filled, one net repaired. On paper, this sounds fair. In reality, it shifted all risk to the worker. If materials were delayed, you weren't paid. If demand dropped, you weren't paid. If standards changed, your work might suddenly be worthless. Piecework punished anyone slow, sick, inexperienced, or unlucky. It rewarded speed, not quality. Endurance, not safety. The third method was credit, but not the kind you think. There were no banks for ordinary people. No loans, no credit cards. Instead, credit lived in ledgers. The local shopkeeper kept a notebook. Your name was written inside. You took food today. You paid later. In labor, in goods, or in loyalty. This system worked only if you stayed put. If you moved, your debts followed you like a shadow, or vanished entirely, destroying trust behind you. Credit wasn't a financial instrument. It was social glue, and it could snap instantly. One bad harvest, one illness, one accusation. And suddenly, nobody would extend you credit again. You weren't bankrupt. You were invisible. This is why mobility was rare. People didn't stay in one place because they loved it. They stayed because leaving meant losing every informal agreement keeping them alive. Nowhere was this clearer than in company towns. In many mining and industrial regions, workers weren't paid with money at all. They were paid with company-issued tokens, vouchers, or credits. This money could only be spent in one place: the company store. Prices were set by the employer. Debts accumulated quietly. Leaving became mathematically impossible. You worked to pay off what you already owed, and the ledger always favored the owner. This system didn't feel like slavery. It felt like normal life. Because for centuries, that's what payment looked like. Work did not buy freedom. It bought one more day. The absence of salaries didn't just shape work, it shaped behavior. People saved differently, when they saved at all. They hoarded goods, not money. They built relationships carefully. Trust was currency. They avoided risk not because they were cautious, but because one mistake could erase everything. And they measured wealth not by numbers, but by resilience. Who would feed you if you fell? Who would vouch for you? Who would extend credit when things went wrong? That was your real balance sheet. Salaries didn't emerge because people demanded them. They emerged because instability became expensive. Factories needed predictable labor. Governments needed predictable taxes. Armies needed predictable supplies. Regular wages weren't a gift to workers. They were a tool to stabilize systems. Monthly paychecks created planning. Planning created control. And control reshaped society. But before that shift, life operated in fragments. Work ended at sunset. Payment ended at dusk. And tomorrow was never guaranteed. Most people didn't imagine a future. They managed the present. And in that world, survival wasn't about growth. It was about not falling. Payment instability didn't just affect income, it reshaped how people thought. When tomorrow was uncertain, planning became dangerous, saving felt pointless, dreams felt irresponsible. So people learned to think short. If you couldn't guarantee next week, you optimized for today. If payment might disappear overnight, you avoided long bets. What would you invest in if income ended at sunset? In port cities, this logic ruled everyday life. At dawn, hundreds of men gathered near the docks. They didn't apply for jobs. They waited to be chosen. Foremen pointed. Strongbacks first, young men second. The rest went home. No contract, no explanation, no pay. A full day of labor could disappear with a single gesture. Those chosen worked until exhaustion. They were paid at the end of the day, if the ship was unloaded on time. If rain came early, payment shrank. If cargo was damaged, payment vanished. Work existed, money did not. This wasn't inefficiency, it was design. Employers avoided risk, workers absorbed it, and once this logic spreads, it changes everything. In agriculture, payment followed seasons, not days. Farm hands worked during planting and harvest, then survived on nothing in between. Payment often came in grain, measured by volume, not value. If prices rose later, that grain lost meaning. If prices fell, it spoiled. There was no hedge, no storage solution for the poor. How do you save when your savings rot? In textile workshops, piecework dominated. You weren't paid for being present. You were paid for output. A fast worker earned more. A careful worker earned less. Injuries weren't accidents. They were costs. Slow hands meant hunger. Mistakes meant debt. And because payment depended on constant output, exhaustion became normal. Stopping wasn't rest. Stopping was failure. This system created a strange contradiction. People worked constantly, yet lived one step from collapse. They weren't lazy, they were trapped. The instability of payment also reshaped family life. Households diversified labor not for growth, but survival. Children worked early. Elders worked until they couldn't. Everyone contributed something, not because it was efficient, but because redundancy saved lives. If one income failed, another might survive. This is why specialization was dangerous for the poor. Doing one thing well wasn't safety, it was vulnerability. Nowhere was this more visible than in urban markets. Prices changed daily, sometimes hourly. Without salaries, income could not adjust fast enough. So people adapted in other ways. They negotiated constantly. They bought on credit. They relied on relationships. Trust replaced contracts. If a shopkeeper knew you, you ate. If he didn't, you didn't. Your reputation became collateral. One argument could erase years of informal credit. One accusation could close every door. What happens to someone when trust disappears? They didn't become unemployed. They became untouchable. This is why disputes mattered so much. This is why honor and reputation carried economic weight. Before salaries, morality wasn't abstract. It was transactional. Company towns perfected this logic. Workers were paid in vouchers redeemable only at company stores. Prices were higher. Choices were limited. Debt accumulated silently. Each payday erased nothing. It only delayed collapse. Leaving meant abandoning housing, credit, food access, all at once. Staying meant working forever to reach zero. This wasn't illegal. It was normal. And for many workers, it felt safer than day labor. At least there was predictability. This is the paradox of pre-salary life. People accepted exploitation in exchange for certainty, not because they were ignorant, but because uncertainty was worse. Salaries didn't emerge from compassion. They emerged from pressure. Factories needed reliable workers. States needed reliable taxpayers. Armies needed reliable supplies. Irregular pay created instability at scale. Riots, migration, desertion. Daily payment made people unpredictable. Monthly payment made them manageable. So wages were standardized. Intervals were fixed. Payment was delayed, intentionally. A salary isn't just income. It's discipline. It forces you to wait. It teaches you to plan. It anchors you to a calendar. And once people adjusted to it, the system hardened. Suddenly, instability felt abnormal. Daily pay felt risky. Piecework felt unfair. But for thousands of years, this instability was life itself, and it left traces. Even today, when salaries disappear, during crises, collapses, or informal work, people don't invent new systems. They revert. Daily payment, goods instead of cash. Credit based on trust. Work without guarantees. Because those systems never vanished. They were only hidden. And once you see how people lived before salaries, you start to recognize the pattern when money stops behaving. Perfeito. Abaixo está a continuação, parte 3, mantendo o mesmo tom humano, observacional, com autoridade silenciosa, fechando o arco e preparando o gancho para o próximo vídeo. The shift to fixed salaries didn't feel like progress at first. It felt unnatural. For people used to daily pay, waiting weeks or a full month felt risky. Delayed payment meant delayed survival. What if the employer vanished? What if the factory closed? What if the promise broke? A salary asked people to trust an institution instead of a person. That was new. And trust, once moved, reshapes behavior. When pay became regular, time gained value. Not just hours, weeks, months, futures. People began to plan because planning finally made sense. Rent replaced lodging. Budgets replaced bargaining. Savings replaced hoarding. But something else happened quietly. Risk didn't disappear. It moved. Employers absorbed some uncertainty, but systems absorbed the rest. Factories stabilized wages but demanded discipline. Governments stabilized taxes but demanded compliance. Banks stabilized payments but demanded records. The paycheck became a leash. It tied people to schedules, locations, identities. Missing a day mattered now. Missing a payment mattered more. And with that shift, something older faded into the background. Informal credit weakened. Reputation lost power. Community safety nets thinned. You no longer needed to be known. You needed to be documented. This made societies scalable. It also made them brittle. When salaries work, they feel invisible. When they fail, everything underneath resurfaces. We've seen this pattern repeat. During wars, salaries break first. During hyperinflation, wages lag reality. During crises, payment intervals stretch, and people adapt the same way they always have. Daily work returns. Goods replace cash. Credit becomes personal again. Barter appears, not as nostalgia, but necessity. What people trade first is never random. Food, fuel, medicine, skills. Items with immediate utility replace abstract value. Trust becomes currency again. And suddenly, the modern world looks ancient. The lesson here isn't that salaries are bad. It's that they are fragile. They depend on stability. on institutions, on trust extending beyond individuals. When that trust breaks, the system doesn't collapse into chaos, it reverts. This is why understanding life before salaries matters, not as history, but as pattern recognition. Because the structures we consider permanent are recent, and the behaviors we think are outdated are never gone. They're waiting for the moment money stops behaving the way we expect. Before salaries, people survived without guarantees. They learned to live inside uncertainty. They didn't romanticize it. They endured it. And they built systems, fragile, informal, human, that functioned just well enough to keep going. That world didn't disappear. It was buried under stability. When stability cracks, it comes back into view. And once you recognize that pattern here, in daily wages, in goods for work, in trust-based credit, you'll start to see it everywhere else. In shortages, in black markets, in informal economies, in crises that feel modern but aren't. Because when money breaks, people don't invent something new. They remember. And in the next story, we'll follow what happens when salaries fail, when cash stops working, and the barter economy quietly returns. Not as theory, as survival. Se quiser, posso agora fazer uma revisão final de fluidez, microcortes para retenção, ajustar 5, 8 frases-chave para comentários mais provocativos ou entregar 3 opções finais de encerramento, mais forte, mais seco ou mais contemplativo.